The Canadian rebellions of 1837 to 1838 were a turning point in the country's history, yet many people today barely know what really happened. These uprisings were more than just isolated acts of defiance. They were a fight for democracy, a challenge to British colonial rule, and a direct response to government corruption. But why did they happen? Who were the key players? And how did these failed rebellions ultimately shape Canada's future? In the early 19th century, Canada was still a collection of British colonies, divided into Upper Canada, now Ontario, and Lower Canada, now Quebec. Though these regions had their own governments, they were controlled by small, elite groups that operated like oligarchies. In Upper Canada, this ruling class was known as the Family Compact, a network of wealthy British elites who controlled the government, the economy, and even the Anglican Church. In Lower Canada, a similar elite group, the Chateau clique, held power, favoring British merchants while largely ignoring the French-Canadian majority. For the average person, whether a farmer, tradesman, or working-class settler, life was filled with frustrations. Land policies favored the wealthy, government positions were appointed rather than elected, and ordinary citizens had almost no say in how they were governed. In Lower Canada, tensions were even greater, as French Canadians feared that British policies were designed to assimilate them, erasing their culture and language. Calls for reform grew louder, but the British government was reluctant to change. This frustration eventually boiled over into open rebellion. The Lower Canada Rebellion, 1837 to 1838. In Lower Canada, the rebellion was led by Louis-Joseph Papineau, a fiery politician who had been pushing for democratic reforms for years. He led the Patriot movement, which sought greater self-governance and protections for French-Canadian identity. Papineau and his supporters grew frustrated as British authorities repeatedly dismissed their petitions and demands for reform. Tensions escalated in 1837 when the British governor, Lord Gosford, took steps to disband the reformist-controlled assembly and arrest key Patriot leaders. This was the final straw. The Patriots took up arms, and the British responded with military force. The first major battle occurred at Saint-Denis in November 1837, where the rebels surprisingly defeated the British troops. This brief victory gave the Patriots hope, but it was short-lived. A few days later, the British regrouped and crushed the rebels at Saint-Charles and Saint-Eustache, burning homes and churches to make an example of those who resisted. Papineau fled to the United States, while hundreds of his followers were arrested or executed. Despite these losses, some Patriot forces continued the fight into 1838, launching a second wave of uprisings. However, by this time, British forces were well prepared, and the resistance was quickly stamped out. The British cracked down hard, sentencing captured rebels to death, exile, or imprisonment. Over 50 were executed, and many others were shipped to penal colonies in Australia. The Upper Canada Rebellion, 1837 to 1838. While the rebellion in Lower Canada was fueled by French-Canadian nationalism and resistance to British rule, the Upper Canada Rebellion was driven by calls for democracy and an end to government corruption. This movement was led by William Lyon Mackenzie, a Scottish-born journalist and politician who had been one of the most vocal critics of the Family Compact. Mackenzie believed that British rule was corrupt and undemocratic. Inspired by the American and French revolutions, he wanted to establish a republic in Upper Canada, where the people, not the elites, would have the power to govern. After years of being ignored, Mackenzie and his supporters decided that rebellion was the only option left. In December 1837, Mackenzie gathered an army of roughly 1,000 poorly trained rebels outside of Toronto, planning to seize control of the city, overthrow the colonial government, and declare an independent republic. The plan, however, quickly fell apart. The rebels were poorly armed, disorganized, and lacked military training. Their attempt to march on Toronto was easily defeated by British troops and local militia at Montgomery's Tavern, forcing Mackenzie and his followers to flee into the United States. Like in Lower Canada, a second wave of attacks followed in 1838. Mackenzie, now exiled in the U.S., gathered American supporters and planned cross-border raids into Upper Canada. This movement, known as the Patriot War, saw rebel forces attacking British outposts along the border, hoping to restart the revolution. However, these efforts were poorly coordinated and quickly defeated by the British and Canadian militia. The British response to the rebellions was swift and merciless. The captured rebels faced harsh punishment, with leaders either executed, imprisoned, or exiled. In Upper Canada, Samuel Lount and Peter Matthews, two of Mackenzie's closest allies, were hanged in 1838 for their role in the uprising. Others were sent to Australia, forced to serve long sentences in prison colonies. Even ordinary citizens suspected of supporting the rebels faced persecution. Homes were burned, properties seized, and communities placed under martial law. British authorities wanted to send a clear message: rebellion against the Crown would not be tolerated. How the rebellions changed Canada. At first glance, the rebellions seemed like complete failures. The British military had crushed the insurgents, and the dream of an independent Canadian republic had died. But in the long run, these events forced Britain to make changes. The uprisings made it clear that Canada could not be ruled in the same way forever. To prevent future revolts, the British government sent Lord Durham to investigate the causes of the rebellion. His famous Durham Report, published in 1839, recommended major reforms, including unifying Upper and Lower Canada into one colony to strengthen British control, granting responsible government, allowing Canadians more political power, encouraging British immigration to Lower Canada to diminish the influence of French Canadians. These recommendations led to the Act of Union in 1841, which merged the two colonies into the province of Canada. This was a crucial step toward Canada's path to self-governance, eventually leading to Confederation in 1867. The rebellions of 1837 to 1838 played a key role in shaping the democratic freedoms Canadians enjoy today. The sacrifices of Papineau, Mackenzie, and their followers were not in vain. Their demands for reform eventually forced the British to grant more self-rule. The concept of responsible government, where elected representatives have real power, became a reality in Canada just a few decades later. The rebellions also shaped Canadian identity. In Lower Canada, they reinforced French-Canadian nationalism, fueling later movements for independence. In Upper Canada, they helped to weaken the family compact, paving the way for a more democratic system. History often remembers great revolutions, but sometimes it's the failed uprisings that shape the future just as much. The Canadian rebellions of 1837 to 1838 may not have succeeded in their immediate goals, but they forced real change and set Canada on the path to democracy. What do you think? If you lived in 1837, would you have supported the rebels, or would you have remained loyal to the British Crown? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history.